Hi. If you're watching this, you're probably taking my spring 2021 course in philosophy and religion of East Asia, or Introduction to the Humanities of East Asia. And this then will be the first topic video. You've already then on Moodle probably seen the general video that I send to all the students for this semester. But this will be the first of our class on traditional Chinese thought. And so we're going to start at the beginning. We're going to start at the very root of Chinese thought today. So the way that this works, as I was explaining in that other video, just a couple things real quickly, and then we'll just get down to business here. You will have a video like this every week. You know, these videos are meant to be extremely basic, just very, very basic introductions. Then on Moodle, where you see this posted, there will be other materials posted, notably links. Those are links I've selected for you to look at. You don't need to look at all of the links. You need to sort of look over them and find something that looks interesting for you to investigate further. And finally, as I emphasized on the introductory class video, you must do something every week, even if you just do a little something every week, because it completely defeats the purpose of this exercise if you just leave stuff and then do it all in a big pile later on. I'm not interested in that, and you're not going to get an A. Will probably even a B for me if you do that. What you need to do is do something every week. All right, I'm not going to harp on that anymore because we talked about that last time. Actually, today is a good day because today the fun begins, and we're going to look at, as I say, really in the case of China, I mean, you have different civilizations in that fall class that we just did. You've got basically the Indian civilization. It's got certain characteristics and a certain complex history. In the case of China, you have a very old history, but everything does sort of come around in terms of cultural studies of China, understanding Chinese thought, and from their Asian thought in general. There certainly is no better source than the I Ching. So that is what we're going to start off with. We're going to start off our semester looking at the I Ching, or Book of Changes. Not to be confused with the Tao Te Ching, which is about Taoism. We're going to get to Taoism, but right now we're looking at one of the influences on Taoism. In fact, the main influence on Taoism, which is the I Ching. The I Ching doesn't belong to Confucianism or Taoism. It's the patrimony of classical China. It just stands by itself, and it comes out of very old sources that other Chinese sources don't come from. So if you say, well, what's the I Ching? Is the I Ching Taoist? Is the I Ching Confucian? The I Ching's just the I Ching, and it predates all of those traditions, and it's one of the sources that that informs those traditions. So let's look a little bit more then at these ancient origins of the I Ching. Originally a practice of divination. Divination can mean quite a few things. In this case, in this Chinese tradition, divination is going to be a very general term, and it's going to apply to practices, mostly people wanting to know what the right thing to do is, people asking about luck, understanding Chinese notions of fate and free will and so on. It's important to see the gambling, I would describe it as the gambling side of Chinese thought. You're really thinking about probabilities. Is this the best time for me to do this? What would be probably the best thing for me to do? And so that's already, you see, then you've got something that's going to be much more holistic than just some sort of reified formal thing of, you know, you get this symbol, it's yes, you get that symbol, it's no, it's much more flexible. That was always an interpretive art, but we have, going back really to the beginning of the second millennium, which is a very, very long time ago in terms of history. It goes back to a time that is when we didn't have the Chinese language that we know now. Of course, you know, it's very old language, but in fact, we have people who are speaking languages that aren't related to Chinese, and we don't know where they came from. And so the I Ching has very ancient origins. In these oracle bones are a practice of divination. Say you have a turtle shell, and you would carve your question. The king would have the wise man carve his question on the turtle shell, and then you touch the turtle shell to something very hot, cracks and splinters, and then you look at the cracks and the pieces, and you divine, like this is like reading tea leaves. Of course, eventually the I Ching turns into throwing sticks. Um, but these oracle bones are a very early example of that, and they are divination in that sense. They are interesting also because, as I mentioned, you have markings, you have figures that are inscribed on the shells, and then the way that the cracks go across the figures apparently was the thing that was important. So we also have these mysterious ancient symbols, some of which are informative and some of which are just mysterious. Uh, so you have that throwing lots. It's throwing lots and making divinations from that. And from that, you, of course, as that goes on for a long time, a set of symbols develops. That's just sort of a human thing to do. Apparently, there was King Wen, who, during the story I read, was that he was in prison sometime around the Bronze Age collapse, sometime near the end of the second millennium, and he was the one who ordered the hexagrams. I'm just calling them symbols for now. I'll get to them in a second. Sometime right around the end of the second millennium, which is significant also because anything that makes it through that Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE, around the last 2 centuries of the second millennium before the Common Era, is very old, very, very old indeed. Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about our terms of what we're talking about here. Again, originally the cultural object that we know of as the I Ching was used for divination, or at least when it shows up into our world and we see it for the first time, people are using it for divination. Now, what is divination? Divining something, figuring something out. All divination literally means just that you're figuring something out. The verb to divine something. So you might think about that as predictions about the future or prophecy. In the European tradition, that was very tied into cycles and astronomy. Europeans were very interested in regularities. The Chinese astronomers were more interested in anomalous things, which means that now, thousands of years later, ancient Chinese astronomy is valuable to us because they have better information on comets and supernovas and things like that. The European astronomers were not that interested in theoretically. They were very interested in the movements of the spheres and these structural things. So in a sense, so I mentioned that because we're talking about telling the future. Well, where is it realistic to talk about telling the future? Well, you obviously in agriculture and astronomy, you're going to be able to tell the future in as much as you've got your star charts and your seasons and so on. Remember, all of this, as always, has origins in agriculture and the need to know exactly what time of year it was and what was going to happen next. And that's true worldwide. And that's why virtually all of these devotional structures that we look at in all of these classes are, to some degree at least, if not entirely, astronomical installations of some kind or the other, because people really did need to know. Remember, you've got a whole bunch of different crops, and some of them, if you plant it before the spring equinox, they won't bud properly. Some if you plant them after. I mean, it's very highly complicated thing. All right. So anyway, clairvoyance is specific information, what's happening right now, that kind of thing, lucky numbers. But clairomancy is just asking, what should we do? Simple clairomancy is with yes or no answers. But in general, clairomancy, tarot cards is clairomancy. You're putting yourself in a situation where you're asking what to do, and you're getting clues and hints that are inviting you to interpret them to help you in thinking what to do. And you can see it doesn't have to be magic. That sort of stuff doesn't have to be magic, particularly. I'm not a magic kind of person, as you will find as we go along. There are lots of ways that a cultural artifact like that can function. in particular, looking at that second bullet point, you have what's called sortition, or again, casting lots. Most of you who have heard of the I Ching have probably heard of throwing the I Ching, which is throwing sticks. But sortition, including throwing dice, for example, any kind of casting lots, reading entrails. So what's going on? Well, you have some sort of random variation. Really, the randomness is actually what's important about it. You might say, well, the randomness is what means it doesn't mean anything because it's just random. I'm going to speak again in a second here about why, at least in the way the I Ching thinks about these sort of things, it's not actually random. But in any event, let's just assume that it is random. Let's say you're just throwing lots and they're random. Why would that be a good thing? Well, because randomness then gives you this kind of opportunity as you repeat the process to see where you're going and sort of what works. I mean, you have to be able to choose from one thing or another, but you know, if those things were already chosen for you, it's not going to do you much good. So what you want is randomness. And that's a really important concept in nature as well. In biology, for example, as I'm sure by now a number of the listeners have noticed that, of course. Now, the I Ching doesn't see things as random, and part of this, I don't want to get too much into the cosmology because I'm going to talk about that at the end of the show, but you've got sort of, think of it more as a snapshot than as random. That is, there's this sort of moment in time, and you want to kind of get an assessment of it. So you're kind of try and throw and get a sample. So sortition actually in politics is the process of, rather than having a direct majority rules democracy, rather do sampling. And some political theorists think that's actually a more sort of fair way of doing things. Why I mention that again? Because what you're doing is you're taking a sample, and in the case of divination, you're taking a sort of sample or a reading of what things are like right now. How are things right now? And so you threw the lot, and it came out the way it did in that moment, and that is a reflection of the character that moment had everywhere in the universe at that moment, if you see what I mean, like a slice of time. And so again, you're asking, well, this is a good time to make this decision. And then, of course, not isolated times, but the essence of the Book of Changes is the way that one situation then is going to lead into another situation. So at first, when you have these people 4,000 years ago cracking up these turtle shells over the fire and trying to figure out what to do, you can think of that as a kind of a prayer, maybe. I mean, these people maybe were trying to get in touch with a more or less pantheistic notion that try and figure out what it was that the intention gods wanted from them, or something like that. I mean, I don't know. But then it comes to, as humans will do, it comes to become a more sophisticated kind of picture, reflecting a certain attitude towards nature. Again, obviously, it's going to be cyclical. It's going to be about process. And that's because human life is like that, and human agriculture is like that. We're going to look at Taoism in this class, the Tao Te Ching, and we're going to look at Confucianism, and we're going to look at 3 or 4 or 2 or 3 classical Chinese philosophers, secular philosophers like Mencius. And in the case of all of these people, all of these traditions, you will see the influence of the I Ching, including, as I mentioned, in both Taoism and Confucianism, which we think of as sort of maybe 2 sort of different and contrasting parts of the culture. So, all right, well, let's get to then these marks and these symbols of the I Ching and sort of how it works, because it's sort of what's interesting about it. I mentioned that the I Ching is not a Taoist document, it's not a Confucian document, it's just a classical Chinese document. It stands on its own, it comes out of the ancient past, and it influences all of these other traditions that we can name as strains of classical Chinese thought. Yin Yang, which we mostly associate with Taoism, that Yin Yang symbol, which we'll talk about a lot more, is associated with Taoism, with the Tao Te Ching. but it really does come out of the I Ching. That's where Taoism gets it from. Yang represented by a solid line and Yin by a broken line. We'll talk about this sort of bipolarity or duality that is suggested by Yin and Yang when we get to Taoism. I'm going to put that to the side right now, and I'm not going to go into distinguishing Yin from Yang, which is an interesting topic. So, so you've got these two kinds of lines, an unbroken line and a broken one. You'll see them soon enough. And so if you make three lines, so you've got three solid, three broken, and so on, you have a total of 8 possible trigrams. Also very numerological. Another thing I'm not going to get into, but it's there if you want, it's really fun, is all kinds of wild metaphysics about numerology. That's a real Chinese thing too, and that ties into what I mentioned before in terms of thinking about probabilities and what's the most auspicious time and when are all the signs looking good for doing this or not doing that. Where is your luck? So so now think you can flip it. I mean, you've got your 3 lines and you can turn them over. You can just make 6 lines somehow. Usually though, starting with a set of 3 lines, a trigram, and then it's got some sort of symmetrical relationship with the other 3 lines. So you've got your hexagram and you get 64 possible hexagrams. So you have 8 trigrams, 64 hexagrams. If you still don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry, that's okay. I understand because I'm about to show you in the slide. Just wasn't sure how to type it there. These hexagrams have all kinds of different meanings, all kinds of different symbols. Someone doing their job will show you 5, 6, 7 different kinds of meanings that each one has. And so what's the moral of that story is don't sweat it. Just see that there's lots of different symbolic roles. The basic thing to recognize about hexagrams is that they stand for different parts of nature, and you can learn that. Here are the 8 trigrams. Again, you see that it's similar to the ancient Greek pre-Socratic earth, air, fire, and water sort of physics. Notice here in the I Ching, by the way, that we are certainly looking at ancient Chinese physics and cosmology, as well as everything else that we may be looking at when we look at the I Ching and its applications. But the I Ching is, among other things, establishing a certain kind of attitude towards nature. You see heaven there. You can think of heaven also air. There's really, they don't talk about, you see there wind and heaven. You know, it's not exactly air. It's very spatial. And here you see coming from Yin and Yang. It certainly won't be spoiling anything to tell you that when we get to Taoism, you'll see that that Yin Yang symbol there is sort of a crack forms in being a line. It starts to rotate, and then all of the individual things come spinning off of the one. And that is that sense of motion that you see in the symbol. And so here are all of the things spinning off, and in particular, the 8 trigrams, which are elementally appearing out of this movement of yin and yang. And here are the 64 trigrams, for what it's worth. So now you know what I'm talking about when I talk about the broken lines and unbroken lines and so on. And I'll show you some examples of that later. Now, for our Chinese history, you know, again, in our classes here, I make the joke. I mean, I'm asking everybody to try and get, you know, their history right to within 1,000 years. You know, that's not really, you know, usually it's a little more demanding than that. But the Han Dynasty is extremely important in the same way. If you're doing Greek history, you know, the Athenian Empire, 5th century BCE is very important. If you know, you've got your important periods during Indian history. In Chinese history, the Han Dynasty, it's not that hard to remember because it comes roughly around the time of Rome. That is, it starts around the beginning of the 2nd century BCE, before the time of Christ, and then it runs to about 200 years of the Common Era. So that again would be the sort of High Roman period, when the Han Dynasty finally gives way to another political structure. The Han Dynasty is when everything comes together. We know about the dynasties and kingdoms back to the 2nd millennium, but it's with the Han Dynasty that you start to see the political unification as well as the cultural unification. After the Han Dynasty, you get the Warring States period, which is kind of this last paroxysm before you get the sort of Pax Chinese. And the Han Dynasty is a fascinating topic in its own right. We may do a topic on it. You have lots of scientific and technological advancements, all kinds of stuff happening. It's kind of a golden age, kind of a renaissance. And during this period, people mostly led by Confucius and a few others think that they really need to preserve the old culture. One of the ways, and this is true about a lot of people. This is true about Plato and Socrates as well. This is true about Buddha as well, and King Ashoka. A lot of people who are spiritual and philosophical leaders are doing the work that they're doing because they are living in difficult times and they're worried and they're trying to counteract real forces. And so similarly, Confucius is thinking about, very self-consciously thinking about unifying the society, preserving the old culture, preserving the old values. Again, this is, we're talking now Confucius around the Axial Age, around the 5th century, and then coming into the end of the millennium. So they put together a lot of things. I think something called the 5 Classics, 5 Canonical systems of books, and one of them was the I Ching. Of course, at that time, the I Ching then was a lot of different copies of it were gathered together. A sort of official version was made. This happened several times over the centuries, of course. And so the I Ching went through another change there. And among other things, because of this sort of rich cultural ferment and very dense cultural content of the Han Dynasty, the I Ching at that point takes on a cosmological level as well as a kind of ethical level. And in addition to its purpose as a divination. The I Ching, I mean, you can go to a racetrack where people are betting on the horses in rural China, and you can find people using the I Ching to try and help them make decisions. But the I Ching is the repository of ethical and cosmological thought of ancient China. Excuse me. You will see these points, and I'm going to attribute to the I Ching. You will see these throughout Asian thinking, particularly Chinese thinking, that the universe is a unified and living whole, that it is one thing. That's why, by the way, with claromancy, if you are throwing the sticks, right, since the universe is a unified living whole, then if you're looking at a part of it, you can infer from that to the rest of it. So it's because of this holistic nature of the universe that throwing lots works, and that's what makes it, something more than random, according to the theory of it. Of course, humans are part of nature. Another thing that we'll have to think about a lot here in our class is about this lack of the European distinction between the mind and the body and the inner and the outer, which is really something that makes it difficult for people like us, English and Spanish-speaking people in the European tradition, since we do have that concept of the inner and the outer, the mental and the physical. Sometimes we'll have to work on some therapy a little bit, especially when we get to Buddhism, to try and see how well we can understand people who don't think like that. The emperors had a very Confucian idea. This is Confucius stuff all the way, that the empire should be a sort of human model of nature. That's like San Agustin and the city on the hill, right? Or or the Holy Quran. It's the same kind of, or Plato's Republic for that matter. The idea there was that, well, we have a sort of blueprint for the right kind of the heavenly kingdom, and that's actually an appellation that the Chinese applied to themselves, the kingdom of heaven. And that's again a tradition. We've got this ideal, perfect sort of state, and for this Chinese tradition, this naturalist tradition, that was sort of nature itself, going along with nature, like the ancient Stoics, same kind of idea. And then the probably most basic cosmological thing, the most basic metaphysical idea in terms of understanding Chinese classical thought in general, I think, is this notion of the flow of qi energy, tai chi. So acupuncture, you've got your points in the body where the qi energy is flowing. Sometimes they are blocked, and there are other ways that they also can be treated once they are mapped. And what is being mapped is the nodes and junctures of the flow of the qi energy through the body. Tai Chi and martial arts in general, again, not meeting force with force like a boxer, but rather using the flow of energy, classically in judo, karate, throwing opponents, otherwise using the momentum that's already there. Chinese art, and we'll see that part of the reason then that Buddhism turned out to be a good fit in an ancient Taoist society is also this notion of flow, which has to do also with spontaneity and that kind of mindfulness. I think the last bullet point, right, is the point I was making before. You're going to try and get in touch with the qi energy. You've got to be in touch with nature, not opposing nature. You have to be in living the right kind of way, following the flow of the energy, and that's sort of your goal. I think this is one of the last things I mentioned. I want to show you a couple of more images. But Leibniz in the 1600s was working with semaphore code for military applications, waving flags like the sailors do. And he was, as I say, a genius. And he figured out that if you had enough zeros and enough ones, any linguistic or mathematical object could be represented by some group of zeros and ones. We think of that as very 19th or 20th century. It's a 20th century idea. It's Alan Turing, digital computation. Leibniz was all over it. He built parts of a computer. But he also noticed the I Ching has a structure, right? Because remember, you've got the yin and the yang. You've got the solid line and the broken line. 0, 1. Doesn't matter which one you call 0, which one you call 1. You've got zeros and ones, and you have a 64 state capacity, right? Because you've got 64 possible hexagrams, each one of which can stand for something. It's nothing like a modern computer that's got enough capacity to put up millions of zeros and ones. But it does appear to be an information processing platform. And I mean, like I said, I don't go in for the spooky stuff. I love the I Ching because it really is so old and it really is so mysterious and cool. And there really isn't all that much stuff that's that mysterious and cool. In the Indians, the Egyptians, it's out there. But in this case, here's the cool thing. It's the I Ching. And those original languages on those oracle bones, it's not even, they're not even related to Chinese as far as anybody, they don't know what they are. I mean, I don't think they're aliens from outer space or it's magic or anything. Don't misunderstand me. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that this is a fascinating cultural artifact which comes to us from a very long time ago and shows a great degree of sophistication, showing us, I think, at a minimum, that there was more interesting substance back in the history of that than what we know. Okay, that's what I don't go for. Yeah, no. I'm not into like this, cosmic aliens and stuff like that. But I am into really cool, really old stuff. Or, you know, here's a really cool, really old thing. The flag of South Korea has, so that's, you know, very uh, conservative kind of picture there. You've got Earth, you've got Yin and Yang, that's the three solid, and the three broken are air and earth, respectively, I believe. And then you've got fire and the complementary fire and water, which is also north, east, south, and west. Things which don't change are important, and one of the things that doesn't change is northeast, south, and west. So northeast, south, and west, being conscious of northeast, south, and west is a way of our being sort of centered in the world. So if we're doing our exercises in our Tai Chi, then the reason for lining up to north, as you say typically in Tai Chi, for example, is again because what we're doing is respecting those things which we know really are true in this world where it's hard to know what's true. But yeah, the flag of the nation of South Korea, giant I Ching thing. Here's a very old manuscript. There are many of these. People just working out all kinds of systems. There are people who think that the DNA sequences sort of map onto the I Ching. I'll just throw that out there. You can look at it. I don't know if it's crazy or not, but there's a lot of stuff out there about it. Here's just a very typical sort of organization of the symbols. Of course, you know, it's how they all interact with each other. And there's another old diagram, and some of these get to be of enormous intricacy, like astrological charts, and for much the same reason, because you're really trying to figure out if this is true, then that is true. If that is true, then this is going to be true, that kind of thing. You're trying to look at the flow and where it's going. Okay. So, right, so that's us for now. As you see, I mean, I just give you a very basic video and some links and sort of set you free. The thing for you to do is always to see if there's anything that looks particularly interesting to you so you can follow that. So everybody doesn't have to do the same thing. Okay, so again, remember I will have our Zoom meetings at our class times on Fridays. And if you have any questions you want to ask, and also always you can send me an email anytime you want. I check it a couple times a day because we're doing this distance learning thing. Okay, so this is sort of our first official class, and we'll do something like this again next week. All right, so I shall talk to you soon then. Bye-bye.